Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Warm greetings and welcome everyone. It's wonderful on behalf of the Health Promotion Forum to welcome each and every one of you today. This is a significant topic, not only for the Health Promotion Forum in New Zealand, but also for the rest of the world. Our focus today is on Maori health and the health of the planet. What contributions can we make from New Zealand, and what contributions have we made already? And also the impact of the crisis on the planet, on our well-being as fellow human beings. So I would like again to extend a warm welcome to you. I'm Sione Tuitahi, the Executive Director of the Health Promotion Forum. Sincere apologies on behalf of my colleague, Mariana Tepere. Mariana, the facilitator planned for today, is away, sadly, on a tangi in whānau, and so our thoughts and prayers are with her. So I'm playing a few roles here today, but it's a privilege and bounty for me to welcome you today. So we are talking about the future of the planet and the well-being of the present generation, us as fellow human beings, but more significantly, the well-being of our children and our grandchildren. So I'd like to start with karakia in Te Reo, and to remember our children. In English, our karakia goes, "O God, guide me, protect me, illumine the lamp of my heart, and make me a brilliant star. Thou art the mighty and powerful. E te atua, arahina ki ahau, ia kina ahau, whakamaramatia, te rama o toku manawa. Ia me ngā ahau he, I whetuti aho, aho, koko I te kaharaua. Me te mana, koko koko te kaharaua. Me te mana. Kia ora. And welcome again, everyone. Wonderful to have you on board today. Our two speakers, myself, as you can see on the screen, and Huti Watson, fellow member of the Global Working Group on Waiora Planetary Health and Human Well-being. It's a global working group on the health of the planet, and we, Huti and I, work under the International Union for Health Promotion today. So that's one of a few things that we have in common, our common interest on the health and well-being of the planet. And I will introduce Huti later, but let us go into the first presentation, which is my second task now. So I'd like to address three things. One is the status of the health and well-being of the planet. Secondly, I'll touch on the contribution of health promotion to the subject matter. And thirdly, our contributions from New Zealand, from here, for us as a nation, as a national whānau, our contribution to the well-being of the planet. So the first sub-theme for me is the state of the planet and the contribution of indigenous peoples across the world. But as all of you know, we now have a broken planet, but there is still hope. In New Zealand and many parts of the world, we summarize the issue by talking about climate change, but it's actually serious and deeper and broader than just climate change. In summary, we talk about at least 9 Earth systems that have been broken. Humanity has pushed beyond the boundaries of those Earth systems, the air, the forest, the sea, pollution, soil erosion, the acidification of our water system, especially the oceans. So as Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said 6 months ago, the broken situation of the planet is so serious that we should all work together. He also highlights the role of indigenous peoples, how we can contribute to the well-being of the planet and our well-being as human beings. There are about 6% total population of the world. They are indigenous peoples, and they play a very significant role in contributing to the well-being of the planet, because 80% of the biodiversity of the planet are within ecosystems and land, sea, and forests that are guarded and managed by indigenous peoples. And as Guterres has pointed out, it's about time that not only we heed the voice and the call of indigenous peoples about their right, but also take care of their well-being and respect the knowledge that they bring to the fore to help us. Around the world, we live as if we have more than one planet, but actually there is only one. New Zealand, our record is that we live as if we have 3 or 4 planets, when actually we have only one. But we are doing better than other nations. In Canada, for instance, you know, the average is that they live as if there are 4 or 5 planets. It's a very serious situation that we should all work together and consider, not only as health promoters, but others who are working in the sustainability field and other sectors as well. As you can see from the report of the IBBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem, the knowledge of and the values and the experience of indigenous communities around the world, you know, key places like South America, Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, and here in the Pacific, including Aotearoa, New Zealand, you know, are crucial for turning around the tide and to make the planet recover and be, you know, healthy again for not just the present generation, but also for future generation. Our reality is that we are a planetary community. We are a global village. We have come a long way from the first human formation of the family, the tribal stage, the city state, and where we are now a nation states, but we are at the threshold of the global society, global system, you know, through trade, economy, communication, technology, and science and education and travel. We are a one global village. And therefore the thinking should be at that level, because our challenges are global, as you know. However, the majority of our approaches are still very much at the national level. But no one nation can solve all the challenges that we are facing. Collaboration, working together are the call of the day, from the Secretary General to leaders around the world now. We also witnessed the emergence of different knowledge systems, the knowledge of the West, science, philosophy, sustainability. We also see the emergence of the knowledge of the East, as well as the knowledge of indigenous peoples around the world. There are some 470, to be exact, there are some 476 indigenous peoples around the world. And as mentioned earlier, our knowledge systems, our value systems, our experience are now valued by international bodies. The work of faith communities, spiritual knowledge, as well as spiritual cultural knowledge from indigenous peoples and ethnic communities are now valued at national and international level as well. So all diverse knowledge systems can now contribute to our addressing of the challenges that we are facing in the world now. And the focus of today is on indigenous knowledge, especially our contribution from the health sector, in particular, health promotion community around the world. And that's what I'm going to touch on briefly now. Let us start with the Health Promotion Forum. As you know, we have been around for more than 30 years now. We focus on collective leadership to advance health promotion. We help to build our workforce development, and there are some 100 members, organizations that are working with us here in Aotearoa. And although our focus is at the national level, we have a global outreach, and we try to make sure that our impact, touches the local level as well. This topic of planetary health, the Health Promotion Forum has been observing that for more than 10 years. And it came to a fruition with our decision to co-host with the International Union for Health Promotion and Education. That's the abbreviation there, IUHPE, to host a World Conference on Health Promotion here in New Zealand some 2 years ago, April 2019. As you can see from the photo there, the top right corner, some leaders of public health and health promotion who came together to speak and to organize and offer the conference to some over 1,000 delegates who came from around the world. Sir Mason Dury in the top far end of the table there, Sir Michael Mahmood, the former chair of the Commission for Social Determinants of Health, and colleagues and partners from IUHPE who came together in Rotorua some 2 years ago. And we co-hosted the World Conference on Health Promotion. And the topic, the main theme of the conference was Waiora, promoting planetary health and sustainable development for all. Sir Mason Dury, as the opening keynote speaker, among other things, offered a new health promotion model, Matariki. You're welcome to look at the website of the Health Promotion Forum. You'll find details of his presentation there. But along with leaders who spoke at the conference, Sir Mason witnessed the damage that has been done, not just to the environment, but to our economy, to well-being of communities, including Maori, and the importance, therefore, of the health promotion community coming together to address this huge challenge for all of us. there were two important statements that were approved at the conference. Those two statements, Emma forwarded to US participants to take time to read. You might have questions later on after our two presentations you would like to further discuss. But in those two statements, there were 4 points the conference called on the global community to take action on. The first one was to ensure that health equity throughout the life course is addressed across generations. The second one was to make sure that all urban and other habitats, natural and built, make sure that they are safe and resilient and sustainable. And looking into the future, the third one was about designing and implementing effective climate change and adapt strategies that can enable us to adapt our current lifestyle, our current activities that are not sustainable, ones that are not helpful with the environment. And the fourth call was to work together across sectors and across governments to build systems that are accountable, effective, and are inclusive for people to participate and to work together for the well-being of all. So that was the general statement from the conference, but there was also the second statement. It was the effort of Indigenous participants who attended the conference and those who were not, but they wrote from different parts of the world and contributed. The statement, among other things, highlighted the worldviews of Indigenous peoples and brought values and strategies to the fore. Elements like the interactive relationship between the spiritual and the material realms, something that are beginning to be pushed to the margins in other knowledge systems, respecting and regarding Mother Earth as a living being, as we are now witnessing here in New Zealand. Bringing back humanity is the center of well-being and as part of Mother Nature's ecosystems, alongside with our other relations, other beings in the natural world. Again, these two statements inform the thinking of the IUHBE, the International Union for Health Promotion, bringing our Indigenous knowledge systems to the fore in helping to shape policies, educational papers, and sharing at various conferences around the world now. And as I mentioned earlier, we have the bounty of putting together a global working group now under the IUHBE and with our leadership here at the Health Promotion Forum on behalf of Indigenous peoples around the world who are in health promotion. And Huti and I are members of that global working group. So, in summary, our contributions from Aotearoa, the conference was a highlight of our some of our contributions to date so far. At the conference itself, the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Treaty of Waitangi, was adopted as a framework of the conference. So partnership at the global level was evidential, was demonstrated. Te Reo was an official language of the conference, the fourth official language. The two legacy statements that I mentioned earlier, and the formation of the Global Working Group on Waiora, Planetary Health and Human Well-being. And one of the Other important part of our work now is the Accreditation Framework, with Tairāwhiti informing the contents and the processes that the IUHB is looking at to approve, so that we will set up an accreditation framework for health promoters in New Zealand. So what that accreditation framework will do is to, one, include Indigenous knowledge of Maori and other Indigenous peoples in New Zealand within the framework. Two, it will ensure that there is consistency in the contents and the standards and the quality of health promotion being taught around the country. It will provide, of course, safety and well-being for the communities that we work with. At the same time, maintains the quality standard of the profession, health promotion and health promoters. So those are some of our contributions from New Zealand, but we also working closely for the next World Conference that will be held in Montreal in Canada next year. So Lavinia might put the link of the conference. You're welcome to register and submit your abstract now or in the immediate future. So I have touched briefly on the status of the planet and mentioned our contributions from New Zealand, not only contributions that we have made, but also looking into the future with our accreditation framework. And to sum up, as Guterres himself said 6 months ago, we are at a point where we have a choice to continue to harm our one common home, planet Earth, or we see this as a moment of truth where we can actually revert the damage that has been done. And the values and principles that have informed past approaches to addressing health challenges need to be replaced by values and principles and strategies that suit a global society, a society that has become a one world, with one challenge of that are combined with others, especially with the economy, the environment affecting our health. So while our planet is broken, there is still hope that we can revert this. And we are now at the planetary stage. We don't want to go further down. We would like to revert that. And health promotion, especially with Indigenous health promotion, can contribute to this. As a final word, the environmental crisis that we face, just like the socio-economic crisis that we are experiencing, they are human-made. And so it's up to us humans to change those constructs that have brought us to where we are. And we can change that through collaboration and working together, as nations and as fellow health promoters within our global community and across the world. And the Health Promotion Forum would like to engage with, in the near future, with our accreditation framework, with health promoters around the country, but also in our neighboring islands. That's a brief summary of where things are at the global level. Huti, laying out perhaps a context for you to share more of what you experience and what you have observed, here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, especially in the spaces where you work as a health promoter and as a leader in your communities and the various work that you you are doing. So I'll pause there and hand it over to you, Huti. And then after your presentation, we will have some discussions and answer questions that people might want to ask using the chat box, and Lavinia will convey those questions to us. Thank you. Over to you, Huti.
Thank you very much, Sione. Tēnā tātou. I'm just about to share my screen before I start, and I hope I get it right. Is it right, Emma? Kei te pai, Emma. Everyone sees that okay?
Can see it okay, thanks, Huti.
Kia ora rā. Tēnā tātou. Taka mihi tētahi ngā mihi whakawhetai, whakamoimiti ki tō tātou matu nei te rangi, tō tātou ringa maka, tō tātou matua wairua he honore, he korore ki aia. Ngā mihi hoki ki ngā wāhi ngaro, ki ngā mate maha kua moi, haere atu rā, rātou ki rātou, tātou ki tātou. Tēnā koutou i ngā rangatira mā, ko tai mai nei tēnei rā ki te whiri kōrero e pāna ki tēnei kaupapa whakahirahira. Mauria mai o whakaaro, te ihi, te wehi, te wana me te wairua ki tēnei kaupapa o te wā, no reira tēnā tātou katoa. Ara, ko hepurangi te maunga, ko waiapu te awa o Ngāti Porou te iwi, no hauraki hoki a hau, ko moihau te maunga, ko tikapa te moana, ko Ngāti Tama te rā te iwi hoki. Kia ora tātou, my name's Huti Watson. As you can see, I'm from the proud district of Ngāti Porou, Hekurangi te Maunga, and Waiapu te Awa, Ngāti Porou te iwi. I'd just like to thank you, Sione, for inviting me today. It's a privilege and an honour to be able to just share some whakaaro that I have around these things that you've touched on at the macro level, really. And I guess in some respects, my presentation will also touch on the macro, but then delve a little bit down into some of the mahi that we're doing on the ground. Just a little bit about me. I've got a background in public health. I've got a master's degree in public health. I've worked in Aboriginal communities in Australia quite extensively, and then I came back home several years ago and have been on the Ngāti Porou Water Board for 12 years now. Lots of interesting things happening there, and obviously in the Maori health space now, given the big changes that are going to occur across the country. I also hold some other governance roles as well. So the kaupapa today is to explore and discuss the impact of planetary health on Māori and what Indigenous and local Māori knowledge and practices that health promoters and other health workers can apply to resolve these challenges at the local and global levels. So this is just covering a little bit about focusing on our own well-being first and foremost, and then what Māori principles, values and epistemologies continue to be relevant for us today, as they were in pre-colonial times, I believe. Our kōrero pūrākau is one obvious example of that, and how relevant our kōrero no nehera pūrākau is still relevant for us today. What examples do we have that might contribute to planetary health, and what can we do to contribute to the well-being of humanity? Because we are citizens of an independent, interdependent, globalised world today. Now, I'm Ngāti Porou. I can't speak for any other tribe. I can only speak from my own perspective and provide some examples of how we might address well-being from the work that I've observed. But I hope some of you will share your expertise at the end, as well, as I'm sure there are many of you who are much more expert than I am in this field. But first, I just want to share with you some thinking in the light of planetary health that's drawn from this quote that, sorry, my screen's not, here we go. Kia ora. From this quote that Sione mentioned earlier, and he actually put up on his screen as well, about Indigenous peoples and their role in planetary health. So Indigenous peoples have maintained their knowledge of looking after nature under great duress through the devastation of colonisation. And I think it's really interesting, don't you find it interesting, that a world leader is now saying that humanity should look to them for help to address the climate crisis that we're in. So Guterres is talking about the wealth of knowledge held by Indigenous people that can contribute to planetary health. And there are those already on the international stage who are looking to explore what it means to unlock the potential that Indigenous people's traditional practices and knowledge may hold for the rest of the planet. Humanity is desperate, right? The climate crisis is real. So we can expect that at some time, if not already, if it hasn't happened already, that someone will come knocking on our door as Māori to ask questions. And I wonder how prepared we are for that and what thought we've given to what this might mean for us. So we need to start thinking about our approach and rules of engagement early in the piece, if engagement hasn't happened already, as I mentioned. How can the potential be unlocked in a respectful way when the peoples with whom this knowledge resides, as Guterres has said, face deep-rooted inequalities, stigmatization and discrimination, inadequate access to healthcare, clean water and sanitation, which increases their vulnerability. So I think that drawing on this rich knowledge requires much deeper consideration than simply finding it, taking it, and using it. These inequalities are rooted in a deeply ingrained prejudices and systemic institutional racism that denies many Indigenous peoples of basic human rights. So to ignore them in this context is to perpetuate the inequalities, even while attempting to address planetary health in good faith by bringing Indigenous peoples and their knowledge to the table. If any discrimination is to be tolerated, it should be a discrimination not against, and this is my whakaaro, rather than in favour, but rather in favour of the minority, be it racial or otherwise. And that means supporting Indigenous-led processes. And so what are the rules of engagement with disenfranchised populations so that they don't find themselves yet again on the receiving end of injustice and inequity and stripped of the precious Matauranga that they've held for generations past? How can knowledge sharing take place in a respectful and reciprocal way that also restores humanity to disenfranchised populations? I just wanted to pose some of that thinking to you. I don't have all the answers, but I think collectively that we have the answers. And at the end of this session, we might be able to have some time to discuss what those rules of engagement might look like. So what do we need to take charge of, or at the very least, ensure that Aotearoa Māori interests are protected and able to exercise mana motuhake or their autonomy in this space, or at least be ready to engage on their own terms? If we want to be systematic as Māori health promoters, we'll be working on our own well-being first and foremost, the well-being of our people. And some might be working closely to the Te Pae Mahutanga model, Mason Jury, that many organisations work with now. It's this, the one about this particular model is that it's inclusive of environmental health and our traditional practices. They help to keep our taiao and whānau healthy, so it's a good framework. But some may have other frameworks that they work to. But we hope that we can work on Māori wellbeing first and identifying what local Indigenous knowledge and practices that we can employ, identifying and working with Māori principles, values and epistemologies that are relevant and important for us today. Te Pae Mahutanga enunciates some of those here. But today I'm going to share with you an example of how one community demonstrated in their development processes some Māori principles, values and epistemologies. And I did a case study of Te Whare Hauora o Te Aitanga Hauti, which is on the East Coast. Te Aitanga Hauti Whare Hauora was established about 25 years ago now. It's a traditional iwi. It's descended from Hauti. Most of you might know where it is. It encompasses the area from Tokomaru Bay in the north to Gisborne in the south. Very strong community, this one. Maintain strong cultural and traditional values and practices, with whakapapa being that strong influence there. And of course, Tolaga Bay is also known as Uawa. So the study examined a community development approach that they took all those years ago to establish a health promotion service that's based in a rural setting. It documented factors that influenced the health promotion model that they developed, or the whānau and hapu developed. So we looked at some of their approaches, how cultural frameworks and epistemologies were used, and how Māori were empowered to express their tino rangatiratanga to lead health promotion in their own area. But it was informed by a community development process. And sometimes talking to some of the whānau, they'll go, oh, we didn't know it was that. But actually, when you look at how they carried out their process and used Māori tikanga to enhance well-being as a valuable resource within their community, is really quite amazing. And it's no surprise that they're a very strong leadership community within Ngāti Porou and on the coast. So embedded in the approach was a kaupapa Māori epistemology. Most of us will know that kaupapa Māori is literally a Māori way. Kaupapa Māori was first identified by Professor Graham Hingangaroa Smith. Some of you might know Graham. He is from Haiti as well. And he asserted that kaupapa Māori is connected to Māori philosophy and principles, takes for granted the validity and legitimacy of Māori, takes for granted the importance of Māori language and culture, and is concerned with the struggle for autonomy over our own cultural well-being. The process is to normalize this, to be the norm. The enactment of kaupapa Māori theory, kaupapa Māori practices the throwing off of Pākehā or European frameworks and the reintroduction of Māori ones in their place. In this context, however, kaupapa Māori theory becomes the agent that initiates change because it empowers Māori to recapture their identity, reassert tino rangatiratanga, and to re-establish and legitimise Māori principles, processes and practices. And all of this was present in the way in which Haiti approached their work with the whānau and the hapu. So the themes that emerged from this case study included a consciousness of decolonisation and racism, the use of Matauranga Māori frameworks, leadership, very strong leadership, driven by an ideology of self-determination, tino rangatiratanga, negotiating and generating support from others, external to the community. They used health promotion approaches and practical strategies as important influences and were found in this study. But the cultural influences that were intricately woven throughout and embedded in the work, all of the work that they undertook. Obviously, it's a very, Māori community, Māori rural community, so there's no surprise there. But that vision of tino rangatiratanga really added that underlying impetus. And cultural frameworks and tools were used in the management of the process with the services that they came out with. But right at the beginning, a significant aspect that was highlighted in the work was racism. And this was seen as a barrier to progress and the freedom of Indigenous people. And as a countermeasure, this community in the very early days developed a decolonisation process, which was integral to aid them in deconstructing power relations, unequal power relations, and to untie the issues involving empowerment and disempowerment. And I think this is what makes this community quite a standout community on the coast. I don't see much evidence of this kind of critical analysis. Not to say it doesn't exist, but to the extent that it does in this particular community. So the participants in this study clearly identified that decolonisation training provided community members with an opportunity to reflect upon the history of colonisation, how it impacted upon them, how it caused the disintegration of Maori society, and it helped them move towards a more critical perception of the world and therefore what they were doing in this space. The analysis helped them to cultivate that desire to reclaim and remain authentic to Māori ways of knowing and being, and critical to that was the notion of tino rangatiratanga, as I'd already mentioned, taking charge of matters of importance to Māori or to their whānau, including the reclamation of cultural frameworks and ways of doing things. And I'm not going to go into any depth, but there were some amazing services that were based on things like such as karanga, sexual health for Māori women based on the process of karanga. Just amazing ways of reclaiming those cultural frameworks and then utilising them to benefit the health of the whānau. Key Matauranga Māori cultural frameworks such as tikanga and kawa were utilised everywhere, obviously, in being a rural Māori setting. Whakapapa was the main thread that bound the members to their history, to each other, and to the kaupapa. The reclamation of traditional Māori health knowledge for healing and building bridges to Western medicine, and they were very clear at the outset that they weren't interested in being part of the primary healthcare framework. They were invited, but they decided, they made that critical decision that no, we're going to be wellness focused. And so they, struck out on their own and have remained that way to this day. But also building those bridges to the Western medicine was also an important process. Most of the events were held on marae, obviously where tikanga and kawa and all those things are practiced. And so in this context, their training was also held. It's got the cultural construct appropriate for the whānau and hapu of the area and connecting to the kaupapa Māori approach. So that's a little bit about how one iwi enacted their own self-determination and employed the use of Matauranga Māori within their frameworks. There's so much more to talk about with this case. It's so interesting from a health promotion point of view because unlike many other community development processes that we might be involved in within health, this particular process was self-primed. There was no expert coming from outside saying, your community have X amount of statistics. This was completely generated by the whānau wanting to do better for their hapu and their iwi. Oops. Okay, so I've got the wrong slide. Oh no, I'll go back to Guterres' statement to get us thinking about what some of our traditional practices are that could potentially be useful to the rest of the world. And I'm sure many of you have lots of ideas, probably more than me, but some very obvious contributions might be this one, for example, the rahui. Rahui being a form of tapu that restricts access to or use of an area or resource by those who are the kaitiaki of the area. It could be a lake, a forest that could be temporarily off limits so that the fish, birds or plants can be restored. Hiriri Mead said that the conservation of the rahui was used to protect the products of the land and water. Sometimes the chief would leave in place a post, and whenever he wanted there to be a rahui, for example, next to a river where there are eels and eelware, he would just hang one of his old garments on it, and everybody knew that we weren't to go near those eels or that particular resource. In Ngāti Porou, you might know that we have still have our customary fishing rights, and so every year, at a particular time of the year, you will see all along those areas, you'll see posts standing, driftwood standing with seaweed hung on it. And that is to show that it's the period of rahui. Everyone gets an email these days as well. But if you happen to visit the beach during that period, don't be surprised if somebody rocks up to ask who you are, why you're there. And I'm not sure if there are different types of rahui that are used in other parts of the world, but I just thought perhaps this concept might benefit others if these, as a potential contribution towards all of that Indigenous knowledge that people are hoping will be able to be applied to assist this whole issue of the climate crisis. And of course, we've got the other obvious one, which is tapu, which is an institution of protection of a resource. The concept of it is that tapu is sacred, but also prohibited. I think, I know that in universities these days, if you say tapu means sacred, then you'll probably get wrapped over the knuckles, because there's so much more depth and breadth to this kōrero than just that word. But the application of it must be respected by everyone. And this is just a shot of kumara fields that were tapu during various phases of the work and growth of the kumara. If the strangers got near, if the tapu was violated, then a poor crop would result, or something else there might be some other impacts on the tubers, they might decay. If the tapu of the forest is violated, then perhaps there may be less birds, they may become more scarce. But it was a way of protecting interests and ecosystems as necessary. And of course, the tohunga would have known a lot of that information that would help their hapu, whānau and hapu, to care for the environment, for their landscapes. It's an aitua to interfere with a sacred tree, says best. We may perhaps extend this to stating that any violation of tapu with a dangerous content is an aitua. But best said, it's emphatically unlucky to disregard any rule of tapu or trespass on any sacred space. And so that's the concept and idea around tapu for those of you who don't know. For those of you who already know, and probably know more than I do, aroha mai. They're just ideas to stimulate thinking at this point in time. And of course, kaitiakitanga, practical application of how Indigenous knowledge can evolve into a socio-political tool. For example, now kaitiakitanga is a cultural framework that local government employ and engage with iwi Māori and consult with iwi Māori in regards to the resource management in their areas. Not always terribly effectively, but there are some very good examples of how kaitiakitanga as a concept and a cultural framework and ethic is now, being entered into legislation. And it's transformed how Māori are involved in these political and legal contexts in connection with their landscape. And of course, recognition of Māori interests in cosmology and mainstream resource management decision-making. Special arrangements to implement this in the management of New Zealand's national resources. So these are some of the ideas that we can share with the rest of the world. I think that in terms of kaitiakitanga, it's sort of quite successful in my view, but many of you might have a different view. You look at whanganui awa, whose status as a person has been written into legislation. These examples from New Zealand illustrate ways in which law can be used to implement and incorporate Indigenous cosmologies with a Western society and legal system to better protect the natural environment in the process. But I want to come back to the international stage again, thinking again about what Guterres says and engagement with others and how we might ensure our cultural safety in that space. But yeah, hopefully some of those conceptual thinking around the cultural frameworks that we have in Māoridom, I just really look forward to the end of the kōrero where perhaps you might have some others to share. Anyway, back to the international stage. So thinking about engagement with others, and Māori in particular, how will we ensure our own cultural safety in that space when they do decide to come and talk to Indigenous people about their knowledge frameworks? There's many frameworks that we can get engaged with, but one I thought that it's a simple one that was developed in Aotearoa in the health space with Māori safety in mind, and it's now been adopted across other countries. So this is an example already of how our Matauranga Māori has already been employed by others around the world in their own advancement. And talking about principles of cultural safety as an approach to engagement with others in planetary health solutions. And so thought some ideas to start this conversation. In Aotearoa, of course, was the first country to formally introduce the concept of cultural safety to the nursing profession. And it was based on the work of a Maori nurse, Huti Watson. And in the New Zealand Nursing Council has a list there that you can see of prerequisites of engagement, some concepts or definition of cultural safety. So their definition is effective nursing practice of a person or family from another culture will have undertaken a process of reflection on his or her own cultural identity and will recognize the impact of his or her culture on his or her professional practice. Using unsafe cultural practice comprises any action which diminishes, demeans, or disempowers the cultural identity and well-being of an individual. So let's expand on that notion to include Indigenous tribes or populations and look to include some prerequisites of engagement. And so I thought before engagement partners will have developed. So this might be something that we can think about in terms of engagement with others who want to know a bit more about Matauranga Māori. And so before they come to the table, we could have a set of principles or practices that we could put in that space and say, look, you know, we're happy to come to the table, but before you do, here, have a look at this and come back to us when you've done it. So cultural safety practice in this space before engagement partners would have developed an understanding of their own culture, so that when we enter into that space, there's a presumption and assumption that they've already done this mahi, and an acknowledgement of difference and a requirement. Now there's a little bit around critical race theory really as well. A requirement that they're actively mindful and respectful of difference, are informed by the theory of power relations, and have an appreciation of the historical context of colonization and the practices of racism at individual and institutional levels. Now, I don't know about you, but I have worked in several Māori spaces, and particularly around research. One, and I'll talk about one in particular, where there were about 4 or 5 iwi representatives who had come together on a huge multi-million-dollar research project, and we had someone working with us who really had not had any awareness whatsoever of how to work with Māori. And so the more that we're engaged in those kinds of spaces, the more important it is that those who engage with us do have a fundamental understanding of where we're coming from as Indigenous people. So these are all just ideas and theories to stimulate thinking, and I'll leave that for Karo there. I'm really interested to hear what you think. Let's see if I can change my, sorry, just trying to change my slide again. So the other thought that I had too, just reading Guterres' statement, he mentions rewards, but anyway, we'll get to that. Guterres talks about Indigenous peoples must be consulted in all efforts to build back stronger and recover better. Recognition of the contribution they can make to the well-being of the world is a great step, but hand in hand with this, Indigenous rights also need to be respected. And so I thought I'd just share with you another situation that I was in, where we were discussing Indigenous knowledges that might be important to planetary health. And of course, we start talking about Indigenous rights and disenfranchisement and all of the other issues that append to Indigenous peoples around the world. And one of the colleagues mentioned that it might be outside the scope. And I think that outside the scope of what the particular job was, but it occurred to me that, you know, we have to take these things into consideration. recognition of the contribution of Indigenous peoples is a great step, but hand in hand with this, rights and the situational aspect of Indigenous people also needs to be taken into consideration and respected. And so the very last thing that I thought, another thought that I'd leave with you, lots of these thoughts coming through, and was the issue that Guterres mentioned in his statement was that Indigenous people should be rewarded for their sharing of knowledge. And I wondered, in what way do you think Indigenous people should be rewarded for sharing their knowledge? That's my closing kōrero. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Sione, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you very much for allowing me to share these random thoughts. I hope they weren't too random and sort of stuck to the kaupapa a little bit. But yeah, nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora.
Thank you, Huti. That was an excellent presentation. You know, you started off by relating to the global experience, what the world is facing right now. We are part of that small island nation, you know, tucked away the, you know, our part of the world. But then you reminded us that firstly, what are the rules of engagement? And then you shared your case study, your iwi. It was wonderful, your experience there. And then you outlined some of the strategies, you know, approaches Indigenous that are perhaps applicable across the motu, and invite others to think of their own situation. You know, what might be there might be useful, but what they might also bring. And then cultural safety, back again, the rules of the game. In the final question you posed there, how can Indigenous peoples be acknowledged and rewarded for what they are contributing already, and will contribute more towards this global conversation in addressing these global challenges? Yeah, excellent. And thank you again for accepting to share your knowledge and your experience with us. You mentioned women. You did not touch that to, you know, some details, but I'm sure if we have an opportunity during this session, you know, you might want to share some, you know, your thoughts on that too. But I'll see if Lavinia, if there are questions there, you know, to us and some points to discuss. Lavinia will convey that on behalf of those participants who have shared their thoughts on the and questions on the chat box. Lavinia, are there any questions?
Thank you, Sione, and thank you, Huti, for that very enlightening kōrero. I do have a very long question here, which you may want to read with me, but on the chat section, if you can, Huti, I'll give it a go. So it's from Sean, who he waka eke noa on a global basis. This group of lawyers are focused on a workable definition of ecocide, which seeks an amendment to the Rome Statute to make ecocide the fifth crime against peace at the International Criminal Court. This is largely based on the work of Earth lawyer Polly Higgins, who worked with some Pacific Island states, and he sent a link. Question is, what stance does the International Working Group have towards this proposal, which would prosecute business activities that disregard the planetary boundaries?
Gosh, that's a really in-depth question, isn't it?
Yes, I thought it might.
Well, I think that question we would put to the working group, actually. But does anyone here have any comments they want to make? I'm sorry, Sione, it's up to you to invite people to comment, but perhaps there are others who might want to, while I have a bit of a think about this. But obviously, it seems to me that, you know, business activities that disregard the planetary boundaries, I've always thought, you know, the legislation doesn't go far enough. I mean, if we're living you know, if we're using the kinds of resources of 4 planets, as Sione mentioned earlier, and we only have one, then I think that the laws need to become more stringent. Our entire lifestyles need to change pretty quickly, but it's going to take, you know, what is it going to take for us to really understand that? Yeah. So anyway, I'll see what you think, Sione, or anyone else who wants to contribute to that question.
I haven't got any more questions. Everybody, I've just feel free to ask a question and I'll relate it to Huti or Sione. Back to you, Sione.
Yeah, thank you, Lavinia, and thank you, Huti. I think our group is small enough if people would like to turn on their cameras, and so we can have a more intimate conversations. One question, but it's, you know, huge, and it's very important. Certainly, we will table this at the you know, working groups next meeting to look into. This is one area that we have read about briefly, but we have not, you know, considered it, you know, formally. But certainly the, you know, the issue reflects the increasing awareness that humanity is one, you know, with the environment, rather than humanity being outside the environment and therefore have the dominant right to exploit the environment to any degree. You know, the what has emerged is that we are interconnected and we are inherently one. You know, and indigenous peoples have this understanding right from day one. You know, the concept of whenua, in the Tongan language, you know, my first language, it's whanua. It is the symbiotic relationship between human beings and the environment, you know, being one. You know, hence the cultural practices of bearing the afterbirth back onto earth, and then you plant a tree on top of that. It's a physical and cultural and spiritual, emotional way of connecting back the child to Mother Earth. You know, that's where this thinking comes from. You know, realizing that harming the environment is harming ourselves. And so this idea of ecocide, you know, having sanctions on those who are producing commercial products through economic activities at the expense of our environment. You know, it's no longer, it's not sustainable, but also perhaps it should be sanctioned more in a way that it should be made illegal that we continue to do that. You know, in some countries, they are beginning to move, you know, into this area of legislation. But I think to be effective, it should happen not only at the national level, but also at the local level. And I think the example that you mentioned, Huti, having Whanganui, you know, the Whanganui River recognized as a being, you know, as a person, it has its own right to exist because it gives, you know, life to us human beings and renews life, you know, for us. So we live, you know, symbiotically, you know, with Mother Nature. That increasing understanding. I think the same thing has been done for the Uruwera, you know, reserve, you know, with the leadership of Tuhoe. It's a world first, and it's along this kind of thinking of this work of the group of lawyers who are now working on this idea of ecocide. You know, it's humans killing the ecology, you know, the ecosystem. I cannot agree more. You know, mechanics of going about it, I think it's something that we need to work through. And I think the more intersectorial the approach, the better, because all aspects of the issue will be examined, not just from the legal perspective, but also from an ecological, a health, a economic, and economic perspectives as well. So we need to work together, on this. At the IUHBE, there are a number of working groups, not just our new group of planetary health and human well-being. There are groups that are looking at the commercial determinants of health, and I think this issue will, will be quite relevant and central to their work as well. But as you said, let's open it up for others who might want to, comment on the issue.
I have a comment here from Christina. Christina's keen to hear people's ideas. This might be one for the floor, about how using Indigenous knowledge should be rewarded, especially in a research context working with Māori participants. So if anybody would like to answer that. Huti?
Well, I don't know if it's I'm trying to, and the reason I asked the question, and this is actually the second webinar I've asked that question, didn't get much feedback from the first one. And I don't know that people have really zeroed in on that from Guterres' statement. But what is reward? Like, and automatically you'd think monetary reward or some kind of resource, but what is a reward, Yeah, how do we quantify that? We talk in research about co-led, co-governance, principles of respect and sharing and being allowing, or working with Indigenous-led research in particular. Yeah, I don't know that that's the reward either. So I'm actually trying to explore with others what would that look like. So I don't have the answer. But yeah, so I thought I'd be with a bunch of people who might know, who might have some idea, who has had some thinking around this. So yeah, what does it look like? Is it a resource? Is it monetary? Is it the ability to be able to come to the table? Because for many Indigenous people, they've never had that opportunity. So what does it look like to you?
No, I agree, Huti. I think in what I'm thinking about a reward in the sense of being recognised, that your knowledge is being recognised, and as you say, being brought to the table. You could look at it in that respect.
That's right. And so the concern that I raised was that how are we going to engage when we come to the table? Is it going to be another, we've got this big long history of colonisation where, the pillaging has gone on. And so we're looking to employ frameworks so that, of respect and reciprocity so that doesn't happen again. But what is the reward in that? Where is the reward in that? And you might be quite right. Thank you, Lavinia.
There are a number of things that I'm, given some thought to this topic. That's one aspect of it. Greater recognition of the origin of the knowledge, not just as principal informants, but perhaps co-creators of the knowledge. Not just those who are being interviewed, but also part of the research team, but also to acknowledge the collective where the knowledge, is located at. If it's from this iwi or that hapu or from the Tongan ethnic group or the Fijian, that needs to be acknowledged in a greater way. And perhaps one way is to ensure that the knowledge in its final form is communicated back to the community. Another aspect is that not only that the knowledge is communicated, but it is applied for the benefit of the community from which the knowledge, comes from. Another aspect is when the knowledge is taken from the research, space to, being translated into, commercializing into services and products. What might be a fair share of the original knowledge holders in that. Take for instance the plant, the indigenous Pacific plant kava, or yangona or ava. It has been commercialized into pharmaceutical products, but that plant was domesticated first for a few thousand years, from the wild, from nature, by our ancestors, and that knowledge has been taken without any acknowledgement and commercialized without any acknowledgement or part of the patent process of those who first domesticated the plant. Yeah, those are some ideas around that. I think the final idea for me is this acknowledgement, whether it's commercial, greater acknowledgement in terms of the literature and benefits back to the community, it should be seen in the context of the social evolution of humanity up to a stage now where we should see ourselves as fellow human beings who are equals rather than one group dominating another. We can all make contributions to our collective well-being, and the frameworks that use to dominate, powerful groups to dominate small or weaker, groups needs to be revisited, because they are not relevant anymore, and they are not just. I think that's one way of saying what you mentioned earlier, Huti, to address, to decolonize the colonization, framework and processes. And when we observe what is going around the world, it's very timely or overdue that we address that, because it's about the well-being of humanity. If we are fellow global villagers, then the rules of the game needs to change to fit and to recognize us all as, co-workers and co-builders. And that goes from the knowledge we each contribute to ensuring that, our health and well-being are equitably, addressed. Yeah, those are some thoughts, Lavinia, on that issue.
Thank you, Sione. Don't have any more questions from the floor. I do have a question actually just popped up, sorry, from Tegan. Tegan asks, says that she's interested to hear more about the decolonization process you spoke about, Huti.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Tegan, for that, that question. Yes, look, it was very interesting to me because I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s when decolonization processes took place around Aotearoa, and I, was involved in part of that, and noticed that, for those people who had not been through that process, that there seemed to be, there was less criticality around thinking. And so anyway, I go away to Australia, I come back after many years, and I'm working and I'm looking at the communities along the East Coast, and I'm thinking to myself, gosh, there's something going on in Huti. There's something happening there. They've got they're very well organized. They have their own comprehensive community plan. So what happened with this community is they undertook the decolonization process, and that's really to do with looking at a critical analysis of, the structural analysis of, how is our society set up, what happened during colonization, why is it that Māori are in the position that they're in, and what things impacted on them to make it that way. We look, you look at legislation, you look at the historical processes that were undertaken, you look at legislation today that still impacts negatively and contributes towards inequities for Māori. And so it's really a revealing process. You're provided with an opportunity to look at all of those things with people who, with other Māori generally. And it becomes empowering. It empowers you because finally you see the light bulb goes on, and finally you see where you are sitting in that, and within the context of Aotearoa today. And what it does is it makes you think about, better, more critically about your choices. And anyway, so this is the process that took place with Huti. Now, yes, their process that they undertook to develop their health promotion started with going to miri, their pakeke, their elders. And while they're talking to them and giving them a miri and rubbing their feet, they're saying, hey, Nan, what do you think should happen in our community? Now, if you're a health promoter and you know a bit about community development, you'll see that as the consultation with community. This is where they started. So they went to talk to pakeke and they did it in this way. And what the pakeke came out with, they started to enact. And so, and part of it, a critical part of that whole process was this decolonization process. And what it did was it brought on board a greater cohort of people who were all working towards the same thing. Now, the interesting thing there is that, yes, they've got Te Whare Hauora or Te Aitanga Huti, which works specifically in health promotion space in Uawa, but also that planning process and that leadership processes that took place back then have spilt over into a community-wide, a comprehensive community-wide plan that they work to. They have bi-monthly meetings. They have leaders of all of the marae there, but they include Pākehā businessmen as well. They include everyone who's doing anything in that community in their bi-monthly hui, so that they're able to work together more efficiently. And so what it does is it really, it shows to me those underpinning key principles were important that they undertook, and decolonization training that they received in the early days was key to that. So I hope that provides a little bit more idea of what it is.
Thank you, Huti, and thank you, Lavinia. If there aren't any other questions, I would like just to, give a final remark, and then to you, Huti, as well, if you have any final thoughts to share. My part was to introduce at the global level, this huge topic for health promotion, relatively new to the health promotion, profession. It's great, though, that we have the environment, being recognized more as one of the key determinants to not only the health and well-being of us human beings, but also Mother Nature as well. And the global group that Huti and I are members of are leading that work at the global level, but we share our experience from New Zealand. Health Promotion Forum is doing some work to contribute to that, but the contribution of health promoters around the country, more than welcome to share your thoughts and ideas. And I think, Huti, the example of your iwi with your work, and where you also contribute to the global working group, and you have shared with us today, excellent contributions, and but also you pose some questions to us to think further. And I invite participants to think further about what you have asked about Huti. You know, what are the rules of the games? What are the benefits? What are the rewards? In what form and how? As we begin to engage with international organizations, you know, looking to and recognizing the important contributions of indigenous knowledge and indigenous peoples, you know, to addressing the health of the planet. And finally, you know, for participants for asking questions and engaging the conversation today. Huti, I'll hand it over to you if you have any final, you know, remarks before we ask Lavinia to see if there are any future notices or information for our participants. Then we'll come back to you to close it with Karakia.
Bye. Kia ora, Sione, thank you for that. I just think that it's a really exciting time. I think that, you know, the Guterres statements have shone a light on Indigenous knowledge, principles and practice, and I think it's timely. And it always did occur to me that, you know, if Indigenous people have this knowledge that they've been handed down for millennia, would they not be a natural conclusion? Would it not be a natural conclusion to assume that they have some answers for this current crisis that we're into? And I think that we don't even know the extent of it yet. I think that, you know, when you think about what Greta Thunberg talks about, you know, I think we've stepped the limit, to be honest, and we're just not really aware of it, of the extent of that. But anyway, it's an exciting time. But yeah, just preparing for that engagement and understanding what it could and should look like. And of course, Māori, we're very much into our tino rangatiratanga. And so let's start thinking about being drivers of that and being the ones to actually engage and being the ones to say, you know, set down the rules of engagement and say, yes, this is how we're going to engage. And these are the rewards that we expect. You know, so thank you for your ideas about that, Sione. I took them down because I think there's some very good principles in there that might be helpful. Kia ora tātou.